Eisenhower military-industrial complex. This 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 article from the U.S. Army Medical Department of Office of Medical History, Chapter 8, Selection and Induction. Yvonne C. Berlin, M.D., and Raymond W. Wagner, M.D. I'm going to breeze through this and break it down for you. One of the most important lessons learned from World War I was the high cost of medical care for veterans suffering from nervous and mental disorders, which, by the time of World War II, mobilization had reached $1 billion. Psychiatrists in general, as well as others in responsible positions in government, believed that the staggering expenditure emphasized or highlighted an urgent need for prevention. The induction of mentally unfit for preventing the induction of mentally unfit registrants. Further, World War I experienced and demonstrated that it was also uneconomical, both from the standpoint of manpower wastage and from the expenditure of money and time, to induct men unsuited for military service because of their tendency to break down with mental illness under stress and strain in military life. It was also believed that it was rare for any soldier with a nervous or mental disease to be susceptible of improvement or cure by treatment in military service. Indeed, as stated in the history of the medical department in World War I, such soldiers constantly reported at sick call or were suddenly seized with nervous or mental collapse, or become involved in repeated military delinquencies. Moreover, while such men were ultimately discharged, they had nevertheless consumed the time and money necessary for the period of training, maintenance, and equipment, in addition to the expense of their care in military hospitals. The World War I history also pointed out another unfortunate feature of inducting such men. Not only was such induction fruitless from the standpoint of obtaining an effective soldier, but it was also a loss to the war effort on the home front, where, had these men been allowed to remain, they might have maintained their marginal adjustment and contributed something of value to the war effort. From these World War I experiences and their aftermath, it seemed evident that a major objective in the procurement of large numbers of men during the mobilization period of World War I was, on one hand, to select men who would be capable of good soldiers, and, on the other, to reject those unsuited because of mental illness or character disorder. Perhaps the most oft-quoted evidence to support which selection was the famous telegram by John J. Pershing, among Expeditionary Forces commander in France, to the Chief of Staff on 15 July 1918 as follows. Prevalence of mental disorders in replacement troops recently suggests urgent importance of intensive efforts in eliminating mentally unfit from organizations. New draft prior to departure from the United States, psychiatric forces and accommodations here inadequate to handle a greater proportion of mental cases than heretofore arriving, and if less time is taken to organize and train new division, elimination work should be speeded. For the record, however, it should be noted that the program for screening out prospective service personnel with potential psychiatric problems during World War I had been extremely variable and by no means consistent. On the nearly 70,000 men eliminated for neuropsychiatric reasons, only 40% had been rejected at the time of their entrance into the Army. Faced with these facts, it would have seemed important to have undertaken new research promptly after World War I, developed methods and techniques for the collection and screening of men for fighting in the Army. Unfortunately, practically nothing was done in terms of research, and very little more in the developments of plans. So, it goes on to the philosophy of selection. So what they're trying to do is select people who are fit for service, who they don't call mentally unfit, not necessarily having a mental disorder. What the military does is get rid of them. Society, since you're in society, they can't put you in a prison. What they do is put you on a pill. Now it goes on to say that, once we scroll down, that there's different types for the disorders. The type 1, mental defect or deficiency. Type 2, psychopathic personality. Type 3, major abnormalities of mood. Type 4, psychoneurotic disorders, the hysterical, the morbidly anxious, the obsessional. Type 5, pre-psychotic and post-psychotic personalities. So, the type 5 is one of the more rare, I would say, because these people were psychotic before. I refer to the first part of part 5. They were psychotic before they came to the army. It was the environment that changed them. Also, some of these people come from violent environments at home as well, which made them psychotic. So we go on to the disagreement section, which I have just enough time to read. Some exception to the program planning and the various categories of individuals who should be excluded from service was taken by a number of psychiatrists and was voiced by one of the authors, Colonel Leonard G. Roundtree, Chief of the Medical Division, Selective Service System, National Headquarters, 27 January 1941, as follows. In view of the large number of draft boards and the relative scarcity of psychiatrists, it would seem to me that the screen should perhaps be as fine as suggested in Medical Circular Number 1 for the local draft boards, but more certainly not for the psychiatrists of the medical advisory boards. The men thus selected at the local board level as having some deviation should be referred to a psychiatrist of the medical advisory board. Notice the usage of the word deviation. The psychiatrist should be allowed to use his own judgment in determining the fitness of a man for service. I am convinced that many men will be unjustly treated if fixed categories, such as included in Medical Curriculum Number 1, are used to automatically exclude a man for service. Psychiatric patients might make far better than average soldiers if they would not be more or less automatically excluded because they had received psychiatric treatment. There are persons who could easily pass the examining boards who would undoubtedly make a poor adjustment as a soldier. It boils down to the fact, then, that the must use his own judgment in a large degree to determine those who are psychiatrically service. His and social adjustment are important than his attention during a medical examination. The warning expressed in this letter and similar comments just readily little, as is so strongly emphasized in the reply written over Colonel Tree's signature, dated 3rd February 1941. Us can be sure that very grave demands on American manpower may not be made in the future. There is no such emergency in immediate prospect. However, and even if there were, the major characteristics of total warfare would probably indicate much the same policy as that now in force. It is equally evident that we cannot depend solely on the undirected judgment of any particular psychiatrist to select those who would be inducted. It is perhaps reckless to try to induct people with great ability associated with unusual personality. A consideration of best utilization seems to indicate that they're finding a place elsewhere in the total defense picture. Now, it goes on to say, it said before I finished it right there, kind of sloppily, I apologize, but it is equally evident that we cannot depend solely on the undirected judgment of any particular psychiatrist to select those who will be inducted. So if the U.S. military didn't want to trust the judgment of a psychiatrist to put people in a war situation where they might get their head blown off, where you rely on the man next to you to stay alive, why should you rely on the judgment of a psychiatrist for anything, much less whether or not we should detain somebody or whether or not they have a mental disorder? So look at the types that I emphasized earlier. Mental defect or deficiency, psychopathic personality, major abnormalities of mood. So, when they were referring to mood disorders, what did they say? They said abnormalities of mood. The military themselves, it's a state of mind. The military themselves were referring to state of mind, not a mental disorder. You could make the argument that they were covering mood disorders, but why didn't they say mood disorder like they said in type 4, psychoneurotic disorder? Because the military knows this is some superficial bullshit used to control the sheep domestically. The whole idea of a war effort domestically is the military-industrial complex expanding their influence domestically to put their program there as well.